physical environments. The requirement of Jewish law to create a pleasant physical environment for man, so that through these very conditions he is capable of growing in a spiritual way, trying for higher moral standards, trying to see if our society can somehow surpass civilization instead of only being civilized, to create this concept which we have been speaking about quite a few times, the concept of Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, a Goy Kadosh, a holy nation, with its ultimate meaning to transform mankind into a higher mankind, more sophisticated mankind, where the ultimate goal of man, which seems to be a spiritual goal, somehow will be achieved. So yesterday we spoke about the conditions which Jewish law stipulates as far as creating the kind of environment in which such a man is capable of growing, under which conditions man actually is capable of achieving that goal. Judaism has a very unique attitude to this sort of thing, because it is not of the opinion that only the soul requires an elevation, but it is of the opinion that in some respect the body, the physical side of man's existence, also requires something of an elevation by which the soul then really can do that what it is required to do. First of all, we've been told in very general terms that there is a law which states that one is not allowed to destroy nature just for the sake of destruction. That one is not allowed to waste nature. There's such a concept called Baal Tashchit, which means not to destroy anything if not an absolute necessity. The example was given from the case in which the Israeli war, or the Israeli army would go into war, if already they have to do so, mainly for defense purposes. The army is being told that it is not allowed to destroy the fruit trees in that particular neighborhood where it is fighting, because, as the Torah so beautiful explains it, Ki ha'adam eitz hasadeh, because man is the tree of the field. Perhaps better, he depends on the tree of the field. Without nature, without the beauty of nature, without the fruit world, there cannot be any future for mankind. And even the army is not allowed just like that to destroy it so that it has an easier way of entering into a city or besieging a city. No, there are certain standards which man is never allowed to get involved in. The only exception where Jewish law says that one is allowed to destroy something is when it is done for the welfare of man. And obviously it is a very big question what actually welfare is, and perhaps in also time we will have to discuss this a little bit more carefully. But whatever may be the case, Maimonides then runs a long list in his Mishneh Torah, the Codex of Jewish Law, of all sorts of examples where man is not allowed to destroy. Not only is one is not allowed to destroy trees, he says was not allowed to try to destroy any kind of vessels. One is not allowed to throw out too easily garments. One should not waste money. One should not waste what we today would call electricity, but in these days existed out of oil and out of other ways by which man would make light and heat. He goes completely into everything which today in our world in which we live has become a major issue, where there's so much pollution going on, where so much is wasted, that here is a very warning finger standing up in Jewish law and says how careful we must be about all this. God did not grant this to man to destroy it. He granted this to man to benefit from it, to build the world, to make a more pleasant environment for himself. It's not only destruction which is of concern to Jewish law. It is also the continuation and the somehow building of beauty. And specifically this is said about the land of Israel. There are many takanot, there are many different kinds of degrees made by the rabbis in which they made sure that the nature and the beauty of the land of Israel would not be destroyed. Why? We saw as well. Because the religious man requires beauty if he really wants to become religious. The idea of living in large towns as we do, with enormous empire buildings and things like that, that's not what seems to be the ultimate way how to live your life. We have seen that different rabbis were of the opinion that one should live in little villages, that one should be surrounded by mountains, by flowers, by all that what makes life beautiful in the physical sense of the word. And only through that kind of environment, man, his soul will be lifted up. Man will start to think in broader terms, and therefore he will become more creative, also in his own soul. And that's the way, ideologically speaking, how the religious man should try to live. After that, we looked in some examples of this, how far they were prepared to go in stopping man to destroy the beauty of the land of Israel. How much man must go out of his way to make sure that he finds that kind of beauty where he can live under very beneficial and pleasant circumstances. And we saw also about the fact that therefore the Torah sometimes makes very clear statements about what we are allowed to do with nature and what is not allowed to be done with nature. Not everything can be mixed up, says the Torah. We saw the fact that there is such a thing as kelayim, which means the mixture of different species of vegetables, of different species of plants, of trees, of vineyards, and even of animals. There are all ways by which the Torah wants to create some kind of balance in this world, to make sure that things don't run too fast, that development takes over from nature, and that because of that nature gets destroyed, in this incredible, let's say, desire of man somehow to start to become a master over nature, and therefore manipulating it in any way possible wherever he has a chance to do that. Now, while we are definitely permitted to interfere in nature, we are allowed to change here and there a law of nature, or to make use of it in a way which is perhaps not the original way for which it was planned. At the same time, there are certain borders where man is not allowed to violate, and we saw even that this is not only said to the Jew, but basically it was even said to the non-Jew as well. Part of the legislation which the Torah gives to the non-Jewish world, for example, seems to include the fact that this mixture of different kinds of species was as much not forbidden, was as much forbidden to them as it is to us. Today I want to look in something quite differently. Also, it is strongly related to this. There is in Jewish law a whole world which we today call town planning. The idea how to build a town and what this town must live up to if it really is built by the criteria which the Torah and the Halakha lies down. And that's quite interesting because there is a tremendous amount of literature being created over the many thousands of years which goes in all the details of what today you and I would study when we would go and study architecture or town planning or ecology or anything like that. This is all part already of the old Jewish system, and much of it you, for example, find back in Maimonides, his famous Codex on Jewish law, where he discusses this in very great lengths. But before I can tell you about this, I have to introduce this with a few other facts. The Torah tells us in two different parts about the concept of town planning. but it does this, as so often, indirectly. You remember that in the book of Joshua, we read how, when Joshua has entered the land of Israel, how he is called by God to divide the land in many parts, and that each part of Israel now starts to belong to one of the tribes. All the tribes have pieces of land within the land of Israel, each one living by himself. The tribe of Yehuda, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Manasseh, all these tribes had their own territory. It took Joshua 7 years to work this very carefully out and get everybody to live in that particular piece of land where the tribe should live. On the other side, there's one tribe who does not get any land whatsoever. And that's the tribe called Levi. The Levites, they don't get any kind of territory at all. The only thing what they get is altogether 48 towns spread through the whole of the land of Israel. Why don't they get any territory? Why do they only get towns? Says the Torah, because the tribe of Levi is a very specific and unique tribe, very different from all the other tribes. The tribe of Levi has one particular important purpose. They have to become the teachers towards the Jewish people. They are the professors, the rabbis, the judges. They are the people who must make sure that the spiritual condition of the Jewish people will continue to exist as it was before, that Torah is being taught in every place, wherever you can think about it, and therefore being teachers, basically, they lived around the whole of the land of Israel. They were the people who run the school system. They were making sure that shiurim, that lectures were given everywhere, and they were pulling up the people constantly to try to live up to higher moral standards. Most of the tribes were busy with agriculture. Most of them were busy with business and all those things. But there was a constant need to keep indeed them to be involved in some kind of learning and in the world of ethics. And that was majorly the purpose of the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi was divided in 4 families. And one family was the tribe, or better, the family of Aharon HaKohen, Aaron the high priest. His descendants are all Kohanim, they are the priests. Their function is first of all to serve in the temple, but next to it they are definitely also teachers at the same time. But the rest of Levi are basically teachers. 48 cities. However, the Torah tells us a very interesting thing. Out of these 48 cities, there were six very special cities, of which 3 were found on our side of the Jordan, and 3 were found in what today we call Jordania, on the Transjordanian side, on the east bank, as we would call it today. 3 on the west bank, and more to our side, 3 on the east bank. These towns are called in Hebrew Arei Miklat, which means places or cities of refuge. I will tell you where people could take refuge, they could go to in case they were under very great danger, and they were protected over there from particular circumstances. I tell you what this is all about. The word miklat today in our modern Hebrew means a place where you run to in case that war breaks out. But that particular place, like in every building today in Jerusalem and throughout the whole of Israel, we have miklatim, these places where you happen to go to in case of war or in case of danger. There were 6 cities which were built on the basis of some kind of saving yourself, your life, in case of danger. 3 were found on the West Bank, on the side of the West Bank, and 3 were found on the other side. Says the Torah, what was the function? Was the function like our miklot? In case there would be an attack of the enemy, that you would run quickly there before you would get catched by and be killed by any particular rocket or anything else? No, obviously that was not what was the intention. There was something else going on. a very unusual thing if you start to think about it. Jewish law makes a distinction between deliberate murder and murder by accident. People murdering something with a deliberate intention to murder somebody, and obviously in a case where murder took place purely by accident, somebody killed somebody without having any particular intention. Now every legal system in the world obviously has this kind of difference as well. People sometimes get killed by accident, also times people get killed with a deliberate intention. However, says the Torah that in a case where somebody has killed somebody by accident, he was told to run to one of these 6 cities. He had to run into one of these 6 cities, and in these 6 cities he was somehow safe from somebody who had basically the right to kill this man who murdered by accident. There is a concept in the Hebrew language which is called Ko'el Hadam, which means something like the redeemer of blood. If I tell you what the Torah tells in a few words, then it would run like this, and then we would straight away obviously have some very important questions to ask about it. Torah makes the impression that if somebody murdered somebody else by accident, he was straight away, the murderer himself was straight away in danger, because there would be somebody who would, out of revenge, want to kill the man who had killed, for example, a family relation of his. Let's say that Mr. A has killed Mr. B by accident, and Mr. B happens to have a relation who is very upset about the very fact that this Mr. A has killed this Mr. B, and therefore Mr. B has a chance that he gets killed by this particular man, who now wants to take revenge for the fact that this man has been killed, and therefore he was running straight away to one of these 6 cities, and these 6 cities would provide him with the kind of security that this particular person was trying to take revenge would not kill him in these particular cities. Which, if you think about it, is a very strange thing, just like that. The very fact that Jewish law says that there is a possibility that somebody can take revenge on somebody else, and therefore he runs straight away to a particular town where he finds some kind of security, doesn't seem at all to follow the whole concept as it is found in Jewish law, where we definitely not allow anybody at all to kill somebody just like that, without first the law having told if this was permitted, yes or no. A man running after another man, and then saying, in fact, as the Torah says, that as long as this man, who was the man who had murdered by accident, did not find himself here, well, in one of the 6 cities, then this particular man who was taking revenge on him was indeed permitted to take revenge on him, once he would not find himself in one of these 6 arei miklot, in one of these 6 particular cities, and therefore he had to run as fast as possible to that city, because only there he was safe, because there they had to give him the security to be safe of this man who was taking revenge on him, while not if he would be outside the borders of this particular one of these 6 towns. This obviously doesn't make sense. Since when does Jewish law allow a man to take revenge on his fellow man and say you're allowed to do that? Unless you find this man in one of the 6 cities, because then you have to keep your hands off from this particular man. Says the Talmud, no, it doesn't mean anything like that altogether. What it means is this, and the Talmud brings a lot of proof for this. I shall not go into all the details here, but it's an interesting concept which is here required. Let's take it. If a man murders another person, the first question obviously comes to mind is, why did he murder? Did he murder the person because he wanted to murder him? Was it deliberate murder? Or did he murder the man indeed by accident? One or the other. One of the 2 possibilities had to exist. In those circumstances, the man was told to run to one of these 6 cities. What did he do over there? Once he was in that city, nothing could happen to him till the Beit Din, the rabbinical court, would, after questioning him and after having witnesses obviously telling him what happened, or telling them what happened, if the man murdered by deliberate reason, or he murdered indeed by accident, then after the man was indeed judged by the court, and the court, for example, had decided that it was a deliberate murder, then the man could very well be executed by Jewish law. If a man murders by deliberate intention, then Jewish law says that the man basically is liable of death penalty. But in case, hear well, that it was clear that this man had indeed murdered by accident and not by deliberate intention, then the court told him to go back to that city where he had found, Rabbi, some kind of security from a particular man who wanted to take revenge on him, and to stay there for a long period of time. In fact, he had to stay there till the Kohen Gadol, till the high priest, who was living in his days, had died. And what happened after that? A man was appointed by the court, hear well what I say, there was a man appointed by the court to go and indeed become a Go'il Hadam to him, that means a redeemer of blood, who had somehow to take revenge on this particular man who had, by unintentional reasons, killed this particular man. In other words, the court somehow appointed somebody to take revenge. At least that it looks like that. This man had to be appointed. It had to be somebody who was related to the man who had been murdered, a family relation, for example. And then afterwards, this man being appointed, he had the obligation somehow to constantly run after this man who was the one who had, by unintentional reasons, he had murdered this particular person, but he could not do anything to him as long as this man would find himself in one of the 6 cities. Which makes this whole concept extremely difficult to understand. The Torah says, in other words, that a man cannot just take revenge. Now somebody is appointed somehow to take revenge on this person, and that person in Hebrew is called the Go'il Hadam, which literally means to say the redeemer of the blood of the man who had been murdered. So the Meforshim, the different philosophers, asked the question, what does this mean? Since when do courts give a man an obligation to take revenge on somebody else, but tells him at the same time, remember one thing, if he finds himself in one of these particular 6 cities, then you can't do anything at all. You're allowed to go into that city. And you perhaps even are allowed to mix with him or to meet him, but you must keep your hands off from this man because the court doesn't give you any permission to kill the man while being in the city. But if he walks around the cities, outside the borders of one of these 6 cities, when he does that, then he's definitely open. You could indeed now take the man his life, and when you do take the man his life, you are not liable yourself for having killed this particular man, but you actually go free because the law itself gives you permission to do so. You don't have to kill him, but you may kill him, and you will get away with it as far as the law is concerned, but you cannot do that while he is finding himself within the city. Very strange idea. However, when you look a little deeper into this, then you can see the following idea coming through. It's not now the time to go in all the details, but I think it is still important you know a little bit about this. There's a very unique idea behind this whole concept. Jewish law maintains, and perhaps even more so Jewish philosophy maintains, that nothing in this world happens by accident. There are no accidents in this world. You should know that the Hebrew language doesn't even have hasn't got a name or a word for accident. In the Hebrew language there is no word called accident. When we speak about a mikra, which is the best word which we normally use, then it actually means to say something which is definitely caused by somehow God to take place. What we call an accident is in fact something which is somehow determined by God to take place, but we cannot always find the physical causes which brought this particular accident about. Jewish law says that the reason for this is that this world, whatever may happen in this world, and however difficult it is for man to understand why things happen, everything happens in this world for a purpose. There is no such thing as a purposeless situation. True, man looks into this world in a very, very primitive form. As I told you many times before, man looks in this world through something of a keyhole, and he sees very little of the total picture. He therefore can't always see all the connections between all the causes and all the different effects. And he therefore starts to think that something happens by accident. But the truth is that if you would have a full picture of what takes place, then you would definitely see that everything has a particular purpose, and everything somewhere has a cause. If a man kills a man, says Jewish law, by accident, then it is not accidental that he murders him, that he kills him. The truth is this. There are 2 points to this. A, if a man gets killed by accident, then somehow in Shamayim, we say, in heaven, there was indeed something of a degree that the man had to be killed. But the second fact is that the person who killed him, however, he is not a real murderer because he didn't go out and deliberately wanted to murder him, but did that by accident. Car accident, or another way, he was cutting a tree and his knife slipped out of his hand and he killed that way this particular person. Then the reason why this man was picked out by God, if we may use that word for a moment, to have the other man being killed is because this man, who by unintentionally had killed this man or is killing this man, somehow brought himself into a situation by which he indeed opened himself up to become somehow the shaliach, that being the agent of God, to cause this particular death of this particular person. And why is that? Because if a person makes something to happen by accident, and he causes pain on another person, then it means that somewhere in his own life, things had taken place, his moral standards were somewhere not the way as they should be. He had created a spiritual condition for himself which was far from ideal. He had made mistakes, and these mistakes now run him in a situation that he is going to be the one who causes by accident the death of another person. This is somehow his punishment, or this is somehow caused by his own action in another world, in another moment, which he may not see always the connection straight away. But it does happen, and the very fact that he's the one who's picked out here to cause somebody else's death is still something to do with a certain fault found within that person. No blood is ever shed, and somebody afterwards can say, I am not guilty at all. There's no such thing in Jewish law. Even when you kill a man by accident, there's a certain guilt there. The guilt may not be the very fact that you are actually guilty of killing him as such, but you are guilty of having put yourself in a place by which you become the object by which the other person is being killed. And that puts a certain guilt on that person. In the land of Israel, which is a land of tremendous kedusha, of holiness, where life is very much not only appreciated but tremendously valued, more than any other system and other country in the world. God, after all, has created man in his image. And whenever man gets killed deliberately or by accident, an image of God is being destroyed, and that is considered to be a most terrible thing. In this kind of world, no blood can be shed, and so that afterwards a person can say, it was purely accidental, I really couldn't help it. No. Every drop of blood which falls down on this floor, on this particular earth of this land, there is a certain guilt involved in this. Even a man who happens to kill a person by accident. Says Jewish law as follows, and if you think a little bit about it, you see the very beauty behind this idea. A man kills a person by accident. He cannot really say, I'm not guilty. He can only say one thing, I didn't deliberately murder him. But the very fact that I was used to have this man being killed, the very fact that I put myself in a situation by which I became the very object by which the other person is being killed, means to say that the man walks around with a certain moral let's say, incapacity. The man is not living on the highest moral levels, otherwise he would not have been put into a situation by which he would have been capable of killing somebody else by accident. And therefore, says Jewish law, this man walks around not only with a certain feeling of guilt, but the court now appoints a koil hadam, a redeemer of the blood of the person who had killed, which constantly hovers around this particular land and this particular city where this man finds himself, by which a certain amount of uneasiness is created psychologically in the man who by accident kills. If a person walks out of a courtroom and the court has said, you're not guilty, then the very fact which often happens, and we know that happens in the secular systems very often, that the man goes home and forgets about the crime which took place. He said, I was not guilty. The court has said that I'm not guilty, and that's the end of the story. The child which ran in front of my car and I hit it and it, God forbid, it died. Well, the fact is that it happened and I drove completely the way I should have driven. I didn't drive harder than faster than I was allowed to. Everything what I did was in according to whatever the law told me to do. That man will often walk out and say, well, it is very bad what happened, but there's no guilt on my side. Says Jewish law, there is guilt on the man's side. There is nowhere a way of ever completely complaining or stating that you're not guilty. And to make this man aware of this, what happened was that therefore this man was told that from now onwards, for a long period of time, there was somebody who carefully kept an eye on this man, on this particular man who had by accident killed, to tell him and to make him aware that constantly in the back of his mind he knew that there was a certain guilt after all involved, and that he therefore is somewhere by some standards himself liable of death penalty. True, he is not liable by death penalty in the sense that he straight away gets executed, but if he does not keep within the borders of these 6 cities, and he walks freely around, if he thinks he can walk around freely in this world after by accident has murdered a person, then he's mistaken, says Jewish law. No, then definitely you have to understand that you are responsible to a certain extent. And therefore the court went out of its way, appointed a man, and says to this man, you should know that whenever this man walks out of the borders of this city, you could basically kill him. We don't tell you to kill him, but we want to create a certain uneasiness in this man, knowing quite well for the rest of his life that he has done something, he has put himself in a situation where a complete, let's say, kind of statement that there's no guilt at all to be found in whatever he may have done would no longer be possible. As long as he walked in the city, he could walk around free, but he was somehow, obviously, deprived of a certain amount of freedom. He could not just walk around into this world. If you kill somebody, even without intention, you lose a certain amount of your freedom. If you have spilled blood, one way or the other, you are somewhere put into a confined situation, in confinement. We don't put you really in jail behind bars, but we put you into a city, and your world is now the city. You can't walk out of the city. And in case you would ever think for a moment to walk out of the city, remember one thing, there is somebody appointed who basically could take your life, to keep on reminding you of the fact that there was basically something wrong with your personality, otherwise you would not have caused, by accident, the death of another person. And so it continued for all the years, as long as there was the first temple was in existence. With the destruction of the temple, this comes to an end as well. But all the times throughout Israel, there were these 6 cities where people who by accident had killed another person would run to. In fact, interestingly enough, the Mishnah states that all the roads in Israel had to have signs, little traffic signs, where it was written on it, this is the direction to the Arei Miklot, to one of these 6 cities. Wherever you would drive, let's say if you would have a car, you would drive around. Every time when you would go to the way to Tel Aviv, or you would come to Yerushalayim, you would go to Haifa, there were always signs. This is the direction to the Arei Miklot. By that, what really happened is that into every traveler, every person who ran around in the land of Israel, there was constantly this awareness of saying, wait a moment, here in this land, No blood can be spilled under any circumstances, not even by accident. You were reminded when you see this little particular kind of, let's say, plate hanging out there, standing there on the side is the sign, Are Miklat. Every Jew was once more being told, be careful, make sure that you live by the highest moral standards, that you shall not become the shaliach, in other words, the agent of bringing about the death of another person and by that spilling blood. The rabbis add to this that the roads had to be well paved to the direction of the Arei Miklot, so that a man could quickly run to that particular place. Deliberately murdered? Definitely you have to run there, but later on you were executed in any way by the law. But in case it happened by accident, you still had to run there quite fast, and you had to wait till the court had decided if it was deliberately or it was indeed unintentional, but the fact was that the man's life was somehow taken for a certain amount of time till indeed the man had somehow repented altogether of his mistake of having made himself open and available for this kind of accident to bring about. Very unusual idea, but the idea is actually extremely interesting and quite unique. It creates in a whole nationhood a feeling that indeed life is so tremendously important. It is so much valued that even accidental murder you can't get away with. Even there you are responsible after all. And that lifted the whole of the Jewish nation onto a higher plane somehow, but it's the sensitivity to human life, which is in Jewish law seen as the greatest and the most important of all matters in life, is constantly be reminded of through all the laws surrounding this particular kind of, let's say, concept called the Arei Miklat, the cities of refugee, together with the concept of the Redeemer of blood. What the rabbis add to this, by the way, that not only the 6 cities were functioning like that, but in fact all the other 42 cities where the Levites used to live, as I told you about before, they also could function as Arei Miklat. The difference was that the 6, when you would run into one of these 6, when you were there, you were straight away automatically protected. Nobody could do anything against you in the city. The Goel Hadam may knock on the door of the city hall and say to this man, listen here, is this man, or say to the council, is this man living here? And the court would say to him, yes, he's living here, but you should know, you know quite well what the law is. In this city you can't do anything against the man. And therefore he was automatically protected. If he would go to any of the other 42 cities, then he had to ask from the court, the Beit Din, the rabbinical court, protection. The city would not give him automatically protection, but he had specifically to ask for it. He had to say, I came to this city, and I came here because I murdered somebody and I consider it to be unintentional, but I ask you protection, and the court would say, okay, from now onwards you have protection, and when the Goel Hadam would ever come into the city, he would first have to come to us and say to this man, did the man ask for protection, yes or no? If he didn't ask for protection, then he was in danger and he could be killed still by the Goel Hadam. But if he had asked beforehand by the administration to be protected, then the Goel Hadam was told about this and he couldn't do a thing anymore. If he did kill him, then the Goel Hadam, the Redeemer of blood himself, became an absolute murderer and he could be hanged for that. He could be executed for that. But if he did not ask beforehand for such a specific kind of protection, then in the 42 cities, the Goel Hadam could in fact kill him into these 42 cities as well. But never in these 6 cities, of which were 3 on the West Bank and 3 on what we call today the East Bank. Unusual idea, but actually very beautiful, because as I said before, it created a kind of spirit in the Jewish land where everybody was constantly made aware that every little drop of blood of a human being was something where one has to be responsible for and which one just could not spill just like that. Now, knowing all this, we now can look a little bit deeper into something else. By the way, I should perhaps tell you a little bit of an insight into another concept. As I told you before, I think I should mention this here straight away, that the man had to stay in these 6 cities till the Kohen Gadol would die, till the high priest would die. Once he was dead, then he was allowed to walk around free again. He went back to his old city, and there he could continue to live his life as he did before. First of all, you should know this. Interestingly enough, and this is only an example, in the city, this man had all freedom. He could do whatever he liked to do. The city had to give him a house. If he was married and had children, then they brought over his whole family. In fact, the Mishnah states that if he was a yeshiva gover and he had mistakenly somewhere killed somebody, then he could basically even ask to have the whole yeshiva be moved to that particular town where he would now be finding himself, because he was not allowed to be discriminated in any form. The only thing what he was discriminated by was one thing: he couldn't move around freely anymore through the whole of the land of Israel. So if he asked, I want to bring my Rabbi with, my Rosh Yeshiva with, or I want to bring my whole yeshiva with, then basically he had the right to do that, and then depending on obviously all sorts of circumstances, one would decide on doing a thing like that. He did not in the 6 cities even have to pay rent. The cities had to have houses where indeed the man could straight away move into without paying any rent. If he would go in one of the other 42 cities, if he ran there, or he preferred one of these 42 cities, then he had to pay rent. But in the 6 cities, the special cities, he did not even have to pay rent at all. In that city, he could do everything what he would like to do. There were 1 or 2 things which he were not allowed to do. He was not allowed to be involved in some kind of merchandise, which would obviously allow very often that he would meet the Ko'il Hadam. If the Redeemer of Blood would, for example, be doing business, let's say in textile, and he was also doing business in textile, and the chances were that they would often meet each other, there was a certain amount of, let's say, uneasiness in the sense that perhaps the Redeemer of Blood would not hold himself back anymore, and after all even kill him inside the city. So therefore the Rabbi said, we better make sure that they don't start to meet too often in this particular cases. So they told that there were certain kinds of business dealings he should not do, just to make sure that he would not meet every second moment the Redeemer of Blood. But for the rest, he could do in the city whatever he would like to do. Only when the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, had died, he then would walk out and he could go back to his own hometown. There's a big question in Jewish philosophy about what has this to do with the high priest. Why should the high priest first have to die before this man goes free? There are many interesting interpretations here. I just mentioned one of them. Basically, the Talmud says that the reason why an accidental murder can happen, and this again shows so clearly what somehow Jewish law thinks about loads of things. If an accidental murder could happen, somewhere the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was responsible for this. The high priest was the man who was the greatest and most important religious leader. He had to be the example of righteousness by all its highest standards. He had to be the tzaddik by definition, par excellence, the most important man. He, after all, was the one who had to ask for atonement on Yom Kippur, not only for himself, not only for his household, but actually for the whole of Klal Yisrael. And if he somehow did not manage to do that, then what happened afterwards was that if there was no complete atonement on everybody's sin, then therefore people were walking around in the streets of Jerusalem and everywhere else throughout the whole of the land of Israel who were not completely atoned for what they had done before, and that made them somewhere now open to the possibility that they by accident could kill an innocent person. So there was somewhere the Kohen Gadol himself had a little bit of hand in this murder. And what happened now is the following thing. By the very fact, this is most beautiful and very interesting, what happens was that the man was therefore put into jail in this Arei Miklat, in these particular cities. What he obviously was wishing is one thing, that the Kohen Gadol would die. And the Kohen Gadol felt therefore also uneasy. He said, we understood, there are people probably praying that I die because they want to get out of all this. And by that they created on this Kohen Gadol also tremendous feeling of duty towards the state and towards this whole concept. The rabbis tell us that for this very reason, the Mosers of the Kohanim Kedolim, of the high priest, they used to send constantly presents and food to the people living in these cities to appease them that they should not pray for that their sons would die. And in that way a certain balance, and again this kind of psychological uneasiness was created by which people would still consider quite well what this life was all about. One man was being killed by accident, and the whole nation somehow is being shattered by this. The whole nation is being moved by this sort of experience. Even the Kohen Gadol gets involved in this particular fact. And therefore this balance in which Jewish law works this very carefully out shows a beautiful way how to tackle one of the most important social and moral problems within the state of Israel. So this is probably something, the reason why only he would be free when the Kohen Gadol would die. It is only to make a good point towards the Kohen Gadol how far he was involved in the fact that he was not capable or had not worked hard enough to atone for every man in the land of Israel for whatever may have gone wrong in the last year. Now, when we speak about these cities, the Torah then says the following. The best thing what I can do is to show you this for a moment here on the blackboard, because it makes things a little easier. The Torah tells us the following. Imagine like this. I draw here a small town, like this. This is the town, the center. Says the Torah that around this center, so around the town itself where people used to live, there was a piece of land on all four sides of a particular measurement. There was a field around the city which was about 1,000 amot. That's about half a kilometer, 600 meters, 700 meters, something like that. On all sides, on all the four sides, and nothing was allowed to be done there. It was considered to be a field for pure recreation, where the children could run around, where they could play, where people were walking around in parks, where there were little rivers and beautiful flowers, so that the people in the town, whenever they felt a need, they just were capable of walking in the town. In other words, there was a park around the city, which was halachically, absolutely a commandment on the side of the Torah to make it possible for man to live under healthy circumstances. Then outside this particular field, there was a field. It goes around completely like this, again on all four sides. There's a difference of opinion how big it was. Many Meforshim, many of the commentaries hold that it was again 1,000 amot, another 600 meters. Maimonides holds that it was double that, it was 2,000 amot, this was 1,000 amot, 500-600 meters, and this was about 1.5 kilometers altogether. And that was there, for agriculture and for the animals to walk around, to do all that what was necessary for the sustenance of the city people themselves. So this was the first thing. You were never allowed, once the city was built and the town and these particular pieces of land were created around it, you could not enlarge anymore the city itself. Which basically would mean that the halakha was indeed, as we have seen before, of the opinion that towns should stay small. That they should stay small, that you couldn't have incredible towns because most of them started small. And once they started small and this was automatically built around them, then it had to stay in that form. Now it is said that this is true about these 48 cities of the Levites. But Maimonides brings proof from the Talmud that the halakha is of the opinion that this is true about all cities, also where the other tribes would live. Any city in Israel had to be built on the basis of this particular structure. Another interesting thing is that inside the town there were quite a few things man was not allowed to build there. The only thing what you were allowed to build there was housing, people to live in, and shops. But one of the things which were not prepared to be built and in any circumstances was factories. You were not allowed to build any kind of cemeteries inside. This had all to be built on the outer sides of the town, depending where the wind was blowing. If, for example, somebody wanted to create a factory, let's say that the wind was blowing in this direction, this way, then the factories were only allowed to be built over here. The major reason, as you quite well understand, is that the chimneys, which brought about a lot of pollution, the wind would not blow the, let's say, the polluted air in the city where people were living, but it would blow it outside the city, away from the people. Obviously, it depends again where was another city. There were also different halachic rulings about this, but this again is the structure by which it worked. The cemeteries were also only allowed to be built there because the rabbis were of the opinion, which is a very true fact, that these cemeteries indeed, they also pollute the air, especially in the summer. If you walk around here, even in Jerusalem, you can sometimes smell the very fact that after all bodies are under the ground falling apart. This obviously creates a very strong smell, and that is not good for the environment. So therefore they had to move all the cemeteries always outside the city. It was never permitted to build them inside the cities. This was basically only done for one reason. The reason was to make sure that people would live under very healthy circumstances. Then there are rulings about what was permitted in the city, how far, for example, the buildings had to be moved away from each other. How high were you allowed to build the cities? I will have tomorrow to tell you a little bit more about it. But there's one particular point which I would just like to mention over here. In the olden days, there obviously people didn't have the kind of draining system, or better, water supply as we have today. You couldn't just open a barrel inside your home and get water outside. People had to go, and there was somewhere a place, a well, which often was totally outside the city, let's say over here, and there people would go, draw the water from there, and bring it inside the city. Now, if we just imagine, I don't want now here to clean the blackboard, but basically imagine that there are two cities, one next to the other. And they have only together one water well, from where both of the cities happen to draw their water. The Talmud says that you need water for two different things. A, for drinking, and secondly, for cleaning. Basically for cleaning your garments. Ask the Talmud, what happens in the case that the particular well is exactly on the same distance of both cities? It's exactly in the same distance. What happens then? Then indeed they have just to divide the water between each one of them. One gets half. And in case it is not enough, they must find themselves water from another place. However, asked the Talmud, or actually this is Tosefta, a rabbinical addition to the Talmud, to the Mishnah, asked the Mishnah, the Tosefta, what happens in the case where, for example, one of the water wells, a water well is a little nearer to one town more than to another town. But the other town is also depending on the water well. What happens under those circumstances? Says the Talmud, or says the Tosefta, like this. The first thing is like this. Since, obviously, drinking water is of extreme great importance, we might have thought, and indeed one opinion says like that in the Tosefta, that let the first town take water for whatever it needs, and whatever is left over of the water of that particular day, still coming from that well for that very day, would now go for the drinking water of the other town. But town number A, which is a little closer to the water well, cannot take water also for cleaning their shirts and their clothes, because the other town is in need for drinking water. And therefore they must find themselves another way by which they clean their garments. However, and perhaps I shall read this out to make it very clear, because this is extremely interesting. There is one opinion mentioned in this particular Tosefta, which runs as follows. It says like this. It holds of the opinion that this particular town, which is a little closer to this particular city, or this town a little closer to this water well, is the one who is not only allowed to take water from that particular spring for reasons of drinking water, it is even allowed to take this for cleaning its garments before the other city is allowed to take the water for its own drinking purposes. Says the Talmud, why? Because it says in the Torah, L'chol chayotam, you shall take this water for all your vital needs. take this water for your vital needs. Says the Talmud, it can only refer to laundering of the clothes because of the great dangers to mental health. Says the Talmud like this, and this is a modern concept which we only hear about in the 20th century again. The rabbis were of the opinion that drinking water is not more important than water washing your clothes with. Because they were of the opinion that people walk around with clothing which was not healthy, which was not clean, it would create problems of mental health. People walking around in clothes which were not properly cleaned would create a certain kind of psychological situation which was dangerous to the mental situation of the people of this town, and therefore they decided, and the halakha indeed says like that the town which is nearer to this particular spring has not only precedence over water to drink, but even for laundry as well, by which they made an important contribution to the concept of ecology and the whole concept of pollution as we know today in this world, by understanding and recognizing that mental health is basically as important, if not more important, than just drinking, providing for drinking water. The other town had obviously to find another way by which it would get all its water. But it did not mean to say that water to drink is more important than water to clean your clothes with. No, cleaning your clothing is just as important as drinking water, because both affect the health conditions of the human beings. If we realize that this was written down a few thousand years ago, where all this concept of modern psychology as we know it now, where at that time not at all yet developed, and the rabbis already make observations like that, then this is quite impressive, this is quite interesting, and very far, let's say, looking into the future of what man actually is in need of. Now more tomorrow, there's no time anymore to do this actually today, I shall have to tell you a little bit more about all the other conditions of what one was allowed to do in the cities. There were many takanot, there were many kinds of rulings about what kind of work you were allowed to do, how much noise you were allowed to make, how much, indeed, what kind of pollution were you allowed to make. For example, if you had some kind of a sewing machine standing at home and it used to make a lot of noise and it would make trouble for your neighbor next door by which you got a headache, what would be the law in this particular case? All these things are carefully worked out in Jewish law, by which again you see that what today we call secular law is in fact completely being provided for in Jewish law to decide on all these particular problems. And there's a tremendous amount of literature on it. The question about what bricks you had to use to build a city, how far you had to remove your wall from somebody else's wall, that one wall would not perhaps fall over on somebody else's wall. Or the very fact that you would walk around in the streets and your tree would hang around in the public domain and it would become an obstacle and a problem for the people who are passing by. How wide the roads had to be paved. Now, all these particular conditions, they're all worked out within Jewish law to make sure that the kind of environment was actually created by which the person had all the options, indeed, of feeling relaxed, feeling healthy, having a healthy body, so that afterwards he could actually work on his soul and try to make something great about himself. But how that works and all the conditions over here, I will try to explain you this a little bit more tomorrow.
What about population growth? I mean, the population must have grown. I mean, the size of whatever town that is.
You build an also city, but you don't enlarge the city.
They had to build other cities.
Then they make more cities.